Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You did so well. So good to see you. If you're visiting with us, we truly are honored that you've come our way, and you are our honored guest today. I see friends in the audience here, and we're so glad that you are with us. So I love this time of year. Do you? I would like you to know that this morning on the way into our services today, that I found a channel that is playing Christmas music already. Now, for some of you, you may say, oh no, it's way too soon. The Grinch is on this side. But others may be like, oh, I am so excited about the season. I would tend to be in that camp. As a matter of fact, I love listening to Christmas music. I love everything about it. I get excited about the Christmas lights. And I kept thinking, what are some of the traditions that have become popular with our culture to celebrate this holiday? Well, listening to Christmas music would be one. Maybe some of you enjoy decorating your home. Maybe you've already started the process of putting lights on because you know it'll take a while. There's a man that lives not too far down the street from Michelle and I, really close to Bill and Linda Price, that spends months and months getting his property ready for the Christmas season, and his lights are spectacular. Maybe some of you enjoy making gingerbread houses and decorating them, or Christmas cookies. There's a lot of traditions that are synonymous with this time of year, aren't there? There's a new tradition that is fairly recent that has started with a particular channel on our televisions. The countdown to Christmas on the Hallmark channel. Have any of you watched this show? My good friend Kent Gallagher gave me the wonderful roll of eyes and said no to me. There are plenty, again, in that camp, but there are some in this audience that I would dare say have already watched several episodes. Would I be right with that with anybody? Everybody's like afraid to answer now. They're like, no, not me. You've recorded it, I know. But now if you watch any of these shows, you'll find out they're basically the same story over and over again. This fairy tale land of this love story with beautiful scenery. You don't have to think a whole lot. You know the outcome already, right? And it puts you in this place, this happy feeling. For some, you may say, no, that doesn't make me happy at all. Today, I want to talk to you about a real Hallmark movie. And what I mean by that is, let's talk about a real love story. Let's talk about the Book of Ruth. And I hope you're following along in your reading as we're going through the story this year. The Book of Ruth is really a beautiful theological art piece. It invites us to reflect, and I need you to really pay close attention to this part, on how God is involved into the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. It really talks about God's providence. I've told you many times that I don't really believe in coincidence, because I believe God is actively involved in our life today. And the Book of Ruth, I think, demonstrates that. There are three main characters that we're going to talk about here. There is Naomi, the widow. There's Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story unfolds in 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we find it opens with a line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days that the book of Judges really tells. The wars and the fighting and the difficulty. And it's interesting, we go from that into this beautiful story, this love story of Ruth. Here we meet an Israelite family, and they're struggling to deal with a famine. And so they don't know what to do, so they decide to pack up their family and they decide to move. They move to Moab. It's an ancient enemy of Israel's, in search for food. Already it's difficult enough. If you had to gather everything you had and you had to leave and you had to go find food, that makes it difficult enough. But the story gets worse, because as they get to Moab, the father dies. Two sons are there, and they marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then they die too. Now Naomi is left with no one except these 2 new daughter-in-laws. What shall we do? So she decides that, well, why should I stay in Moab when I have nothing here? I have family in Israel. Why don't I move back to Israel? And she really tries to convince her new daughter-in-laws that they need to stay here in Moab, and that she's going back to Israel, because she understands how difficult it would be for a foreign, unmarried woman in Israel. Orpah, excuse me. I knew I would do that. You get a car. She decides to leave. Start something new. But Ruth says, no, I'm not leaving. I'm staying. I committed. I am with you. She said, don't you love this passage that we read earlier? She says, where you go, I will go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And the 2 of them returned to Israel together. And then chapter 1 concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara. I don't know if you realize that Mara in Hebrew means bitter. And she laments over her tragic fate. Have you ever been there? Have you been at that time in your life before, where you wonder, where is God? You know what I'm talking about. Where it seems like all is lost, when there's no hope. Naomi has reached that point. She's lost everything she knew. She left to find food to sustain her family. Now her family is gone. And really in her mindset is she's going back home, probably to die as well. God, where are you? Maybe you've asked that very question before. I can only imagine the tear-filled nights that Naomi experienced. And then we come into chapter 2, and it begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. It just so happens that it's the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to find food for her and Naomi, and she just so happens to come upon this farm that was owned by a man named Boaz. The crazy part of this is Boaz is not just any ordinary Israelite farmer. He's related to Naomi. How in the world? Surely happenstance. Or is God continuing to weave circumstances with his people's choices? God uses our choices, our decisions, our actions, and he interweaves it with his plan. So Ruth starts gathering barley to feed her and Naomi, and Boaz recognizes her and he asks, what's her story? I'm sure Ruth was nervous about that. You can only imagine, here I am, a foreign woman, and I'm collecting barley from an Israelite farm. Maybe he even recognized that she was a Moabite. Maybe he would not like her just based on her heritage. But instead, they find out that Boaz is a man of noble character. Do you ever think that when people are dealing with hard things, that they need someone to come into their story that has noble character? Do you ever think that God uses us, his people, to intertwine with other people's story by allowing the Spirit to live through us so that we can help people at just the right time when they are out of hope? Well, Boaz comes in at just the right time. And he asked about Ruth. And not only did he ask about her, but then he shows remarkable generosity. He makes special provisions that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain from his field. Now, maybe what you don't know is that Boaz is actually just obeying the Torah. He's obeying the books of the law. You look in Deuteronomy 24, verse 19, and they're told to show grace upon those who are poor, to show generosity to the immigrants. This noble man is following what Scripture tells him to do. Boaz was so impressed with Ruth's story. He was so impressed by her loyalty that we're told that he actually starts praying for Ruth and Naomi. We're told that he prays that God would reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home. She comes home to Naomi with food, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz. And she's ecstatic. She's thrilled. You met Boaz. Now, here's something that's really important. Boaz is our family's redeemer. What? You see, a family redeemer was a cultural practice in Israel. When a man would die, if a family were left, if he left a wife and children, if he left property, that one of his relatives would marry his widow and they would take care of the property and the children, and they would become the redeemer for the family. Naomi goes from no hope to a glimpse of hope. Naomi goes from coming home to die, maybe to see God's plan on how she should live, through a redeemer. Do we need a redeemer today? So chapter 3 begins, and And Naomi and Ruth have got, Naomi's got a really more of a excitement now because of this possibility of hope. And so her and Ruth come up with a plan. They come up with a plan so Boaz would recognize their situation. And so they decide that Ruth would no longer wear clothes of a mourning widow. Do any of you ladies out there have daughters that you've tried to set up before? Or any of you daughters out there have mothers that have tried to set you up with guys before? And so they're going to make their plan clear. They're going to get rid of her mourning, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz at the farm one night, and as she approaches, Boaz is asleep, and he's startled as she comes to see him. But Ruth speaks very, very boldly again and makes her intentions very clear when she asks Boaz, will you redeem Naomi and her family, and will you marry me? Boaz is just absolutely amazed again by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He calls her, now listen to this, see if you remember this. He calls her a woman of noble character. Where else do we see that? It's the exact same term we find in Proverbs 31 when it talks about a woman of noble character, how valuable she is. That author calls her priceless. That's the same term that Boaz speaks about Ruth. And so Boaz tells Ruth, wait until the next day and I will redeem both you and Naomi in front of the town leaders. So the chapter 3 ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel at all the things that God has done with the recent events. Do you ever take inventory? Do any of you ever do this? Do you ever take inventory of your blessings? Or are we constantly forgetting to look around at how God is active in our life? I tend to find that when I don't take inventory of my blessings, I tend to concentrate on the things that I don't have instead of concentrating on the things that I do have that I've been blessed with. When I'm not constantly reminded how God is working in my life, I tend to feel about how Satan is constantly on the prowl. Naomi, this wise woman, Ruth, this woman of noble character, they count their blessings. They see how God is at work. Chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out at the last minute, Boaz discovers that there's actually a family member that is closer to Naomi than he is. And that he is actually eligible before him to redeem the family. That kind of probably had to be a little bit of a heartache for Boaz, didn't it? He'd already recognized her before, and he's got to know her, and he wants to marry her. But there's this other guy. And so this other guy is asked, do you want to become the family's redeemer? Do you want the property of Naomi? But you do need to understand that if you take the property and you become the redeemer of this family, that you'll have to marry Ruth the Moabite. And so this man declines. Can you imagine the celebration that Boaz had inside of himself? Now, I'm sure he tried to play it cool. He tried to play it down. But can you imagine how excited he is when he found out? Yes! I'm gonna gain property, but more importantly, a noble woman is about to be my partner. Yes! I'm so excited. You see, Boaz knew Ruth's true character. Boaz knew how loyal Ruth had been to Naomi. Boaz knew what kind of wife she would be well before he decided he would marry her. And now Boaz is showing his loyalty to the family as well. I love the end of the story because it completely reverses all of the tragedy from chapter 1. The death of a son and a husband is reversed as Ruth marries, and her and Boaz give birth to a newborn son, Obed. And we're told that it gives great joy to Naomi. And the symmetry between the opening and closing is even more remarkable. Remember, at the beginning of this story, we see that this great tragedy was followed by an unbelievable act of loyalty. That now is matched by Boaz's act of loyalty as he leads the family to restoration. Now, you need to understand that there's a real curious fact about this story and also about a story of Esther coming up later this year as we talk about this. And that is how little God is actually mentioned in the story. Characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator never mentions God doing anything directly in the story. But clearly, God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, isn't it? Weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy makes her believe that God is punishing her. The reality is God is working to restore her and her family and is doing it through Ruth. Her boldness and her loyalty brings healing. It brings healing to Naomi, but not without Boaz, the Israelite farmer, who is full of generosity and loyalty. So God uses Boaz's integrity along with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. Do we have any Ruths in the audience? I'm not talking about a name. Do we have any Ruths in the audience that God has a special plan for you to help redeem someone else? Do we have any Boaz men in the audience? Do we have any men who are on mission for God to help restore and redeem someone who is lost and is at wit's end? What if Boaz would have said, nah, no thanks? What if Ruth would have agreed with Naomi back in Moab, and said, you know, you're right, I'm going to start again here. Sometimes it's difficult to do the right thing, but it's never wrong to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. And sometimes the difficulty doesn't pay off at first because we think, oh, if only I'd have done the wrong thing, where would I be? But what we find out is when you do the right thing, God notices it. We're called to do the right thing even when we're not comfortable. We're called to do the right thing even if it requires picking up and moving. We're required to do the right thing even when we think no one will accept me. We're required to do the right thing and to speak out boldly. Do we have anybody in the audience that feels like they're a Ruth or a Boaz? Because we find out that God will bless the right thing if we'll be patient. What we tend to do is borrow trouble for today. We're great at that, aren't we? We borrow trouble today when God hasn't given us the energy to deal with the trouble that's coming along later. God's given us the energy to deal with today, with today's energy. And why would I borrow trouble from tomorrow when God's given me the energy for today? And so why don't I just do the right thing today and not worry about tomorrow? Because what I'll find out is when tomorrow comes, God will give me new strength to deal with it. And what I'll find out is when I continue to do the right thing day after day after day, I will see my Redeemer. I will be restored. God has a plan. It will be unfolded. We'll see that come to fruition when we do the right thing. When we do the right thing. So the story explores how God interplays his purpose and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purpose to this world. And this just isn't a story of the Old Testament. God is working today as well. He is just as active. And that leads to the real ending of this story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, doesn't it? Showing how Boaz and Ruth's son Obed was the grandfather of King David, from whom the lineage of the Messiah came. All of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. So the book of Ruth invites us to consider this. How is God at work in the mundane events of your life? If you don't believe it, you're wrong. If you don't see it, open your eyes. If you don't feel it, look for someone of noble character. If you need help with it, that's why we sing this song. So if we can help you this morning, why don't you come while we stand and sing?